Hey guys, Dr. Dinka here with this week's lesson on post-colonialism and post-colonial France. And I have a PowerPoint for you that accompanies some of this lecture to better explain the ideas and concepts that we'll be studying this week. Our reading will be a little bit different because we're going to be looking at um, a very influential theorist for post-colonialism, and that's Frantz Fanon. And you have the text on Canvas. It's a theoretical text, as I mentioned, and I am including some additional information in this lecture. Hope you find it useful. Okay. All right, so let's get started. So first, about post-colonial France and post-colonialism in general. What is it? So it's a critical academic study of the cultural, political, and economic legacy of colonialism and imperialism, focusing on the impact of human control and exploitation of colonized people and their lands. And more specifically, it is a critical theory analysis of the history, culture, literature, and discourse of usually imperial power. Okay. If you remember from last week's lecture, we talked about the case of Saint-Domingue of Haiti and how they achieved independence. But what happens afterwards? And in some countries, why aren't they able to be successful as independent nations? And Frantz Fanon is going to give us an insight into this dynamics of post-colonialism. Okay. Now, this concept encompasses a wide variety of approaches, and theoreticians may not always agree on a common set of definitions. Okay. But on a simple level, through anthropology, it may seek to build a better understanding of colonial life based on the assumption that the colonial rulers are unreliable narrators from the point of view of the colonized people. And on a deeper level, post-colonialism examines the social and political power relations that sustain colonialism and neo-colonialism, including the social, political, and cultural narrative surrounding the colonizer and the colonized. And this is very important to note that this concept of post-colonialism and its legacies can be applied not just to France. People apply it to countries that were part of England or of the Spanish Empire, even the Ottoman Empire. Okay. Legacy of post-colonialism that it's talked about, especially in so-called third world countries, are its inequality. And you can see in this picture here, this is from a journalist and photographer, Tuca Vieira, who took this photograph in Sao Paulo to show the inequality between people there. So here on the right, you have those folks with money. Normally, they are descendants of people who are wealthy in the colonial times, sometimes former slave owners. And then on the left side, you have these favelas or shanty towns, people living in poverty, and they are literally separated by a fence. So this contrast of poverty and wealth, right? This inequality, it's astounding. Talking about France in particular, a very influential post-colonial theorist is Frantz Fanon, and Frantz Fanon was born in Martinique. Remember, it was a colony of France in 1925. He studied psychiatry in France, and this shaped his views that he had a lot on the book that he published later on. And this book that we'll be discussing today was actually supposed to be his doctoral dissertation, but it was deemed too controversial at the time, so he couldn't do that. So he had to do it on a different topic. After he obtained his license, psychiatry license, he went to Algeria, which was then still part of France, to work at a hospital at Blida, where he joined the struggle for Algerian liberation. And he wrote about colonialism and the struggle against it from a point of view that tried to understand violence and its role in decolonization. And this is important, okay? He died young at the age of 36 in 1961. And he was actually working as a psychiatrist in a hospital in Algiers, and confronted in his daily job with both French police torturers and their Algerian victims, and the psychological trauma that those events had on the patients. Fanon became convinced that psychiatric treatment could not work without the destruction of colonialism that he called an absolute evil. And he later joined the Algerian rebels in their fight for independence from France. And here you have a picture of Martinique. So Fanon writes that the colonized indigenous person only begins to question their value as a human being when the reality as a human being is challenged. So when it's left alone, he does well. In other words, and this is a quotation from him, he said, "I begin to suffer from not being a white man to the degree that the white man imposes discrimination on me, makes me a colonized native, tells me that I am a parasite on the world, that I must bring myself as quickly as possible into step with the white world." Now, we are talking about in a lot of Fanon's concepts in terms of race, but if you substitute this the white world with the dominant world, the dominant culture, then his theory can be applied to minorities as well, right? So it can be somebody who is a religious minority in a larger dominant culture, or they can be, for example, somebody that's an ethnic minority, okay? Or even somebody who struggles, for example, with body image issues and finds himself or herself alienated in a world that has a lot of dominant, unrealistic standards for what a person should look like. Or it can also represent somebody with disability. So his ideas are, as I said, written specifically from an analysis of race, but it can apply to other dynamics as well, where we have a dominant power, dominant culture, and a minority. And we'll actually see this in one of the videos that we'll be studying today when we're looking at the Cajun culture, okay? Now, it's very interesting that Fanon says every form of exploitation resembles one another, and colonial racism is no different than any kind of racism. And he was surprised that his fellow Martinicans denied their blackness despite the fact that they were black. So according to Fanon, the solution to this was that blacks must be liberated from an inferiority complex, and the whites from a superiority complex. That was his solution. Okay, so again, Fanon is key for the post-colonial theory. Now, in Fanon's view, the Western bourgeoisie was fundamentally racist, he mentions, and its bourgeoisie ideology of equality and dignity was merely a cover for capitalist imperial rapacity. And this is something that has been written more recently by other scholars as well. We have the book, for example, of Daniel Hedrick, titled The Tools of Empire, Technology, and European Imperialism in the 19th Century. So when Fanon wrote a lot of his ideas, it was in the 1950s. So he really was ahead of his time in a lot of the ideas that he had. He also mentioned that a black man's identity, the destruction of his culture and community, and the poisoning of his inner life with a sense of inferiority were the results of this Western white bourgeoisie ideology. And what ends up happening, because remember, he was a psychiatrist, and something that people who have been traumatized, that have gone through a lot of psychological trauma, they end up internalizing some of those messages. So in this case, we have people internalizing inferiority. And that was the problem that Fanon saw with some of his fellow Martinicans. But at the same time, because he was a psychiatrist and he writes from the point of view of a doctor, so he was looking for a solution, a treatment, a healing method, okay, for some of these issues. So in this respect, he urged the colonized to stop accusing their white masters and to do what the latter had so conspicuously failed to do, and that is to start a new history of man that advanced universalizing values. And in his view, anti-colonial nationalism was only the first step toward a new radical humanism for Europe, for ourselves, and for humanity. And he even quotes in his book, Black Skin, White Masks, that we're discussing today, that in a way, do I have to dedicate myself to reviving a black civilization unjustly ignored? And I will not make myself the man of any past. So in other words, he saw no point in trying to shame people through exposure to the grisly effects of slavery and imperialism. Am I going to ask today's white men to answer for the slave traders of the 17th century? He asks rhetorically. And again, his solution to a lot of these issues were for people to put value on themselves, on their identity. So this is when he mentions that blacks must be liberated from an inferiority complex and whites from a superiority complex. And this is when we can have this universalizing values of both races and all races in general. Now, we mentioned that one of his most important text is actually his Peau Noir, Masque Blanc, Black Skin, White Masks, that was published in 1952. And as I mentioned, this was actually his doctoral dissertation. So this is what the research that he was doing in order to earn his degree. So his book, it's a multidisciplinary analysis of the effect of colonialism on racial consciousness. It integrates psychoanalysis, phenomenology, existentialism, and negritude theory. And Fanon articulated an expansive view of the psychosocial repercussions of colonialism on colonized people. And this is a very important book because at the time, not many scholars were writing about this. And the publication shortly before his death of his other book, The Wretched of the Earth, established Fanon as a leading intellectual in the international decolonization movement. And the preface to his book was actually written by Jean-Paul Sartre, which was a very important French philosopher as well. Now, Fanon perceived colonialism as a form of domination whose necessary goal for success was actually the reordering of the world of indigenous or native peoples. And it's very important that he doesn't just talk about the French people in particular, right? But he talks about any indigenous group that were marginalized. You can even talk about Native Americans in what's today the United States, right? So if you think about when the United States became independent from England, how are the indigenous population treated? And since we're focusing on France today, we'll look at the case that he gives us from his own country, from Martinique. And also Fanon saw violence as the defining characteristic of colonialism, and we have seen plenty examples of this even last week with the institution of slavery and its devastating effects on people and society. And if violence was a tool for social control, it may also, argued Fanon, be a cathartic reaction to the oppression of colonialism and a necessary tool of political engagement. And Fanon was naturally critical of the institutions of colonialism, but he also was an early critic of the post-colonial governments, which failed to achieve freedom from colonial influences and establish a national consciousness among the newly liberated populace. And for Fanon, the rise of corruption, ethnic division, racism, and economic dependence on former colonial states resulted from the mediocrity of Africa's elite leadership class. And it's interesting that a lot of former colonies that France had in Africa still are going through these issues because, in a way, they're still depending on France for, especially economically, because of this institution that was put in place of colonialism, right? Of a certain way of life and a certain dynamic that started with the dominant culture at the top and then the colonized at the bottom. Okay. All right, so let's continue. So across the core chapters of Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon draws together the existential experience of the colonial rule. And for Fanon, this is very important because colonialism for him is a total project. This is very important, okay? It's a project that does not leave any part of the human person and its reality untouched. And for him, for Fanon, is no more evident than in the opening chapter to Black Skin, White Masks, where he analyzes language. And Fanon's reflections on language, racism, and colonialism begin with a white claim. For him is that to speak a language is to participate in a world, to adopt a civilization. And we looked at this notion before, if you remember, when we talked about France's civilized mission, right? Where language contributed to this so-called mission that France has had around the world. Okay. And something that Fanon said in regards to this, and I quote from his book, and you have the quote here as well. It says, the problem that we confront in this chapter is this, the Black man, he uses this other term in his book, but in the more modernized editions of the book, this is replaced by the word the Black man. So the Black man of the Antilles, Antilles is that region of the Caribbean where we have Martinique, Guadeloupe, will be proportionately wider. That is, he will come closer to being a real human being in direct relation to his mastery of the French language. A man who has a language consequently possesses the world expressed and implied by the language. And then he continues saying, every colonized people, in other words, every people in whose soul an inferiority complex has been created by the death and burial of its local cultural originality, finds itself face to face with the language of the civilizing nation, that is, with the culture of the mother country. The colonized is elevated above his jungle status in proportion to his adoption of the mother country's cultural standards. And he was talking in particular about the Creole language that a lot of his that is spoken in Martinique and in some of the other islands that were former French colonies. And if speaking a language means participating in a world and adopting a civilization, then the language of the colonized, a language imposed by centuries of colonial domination and dedicated to the elimination or objection of odd expressive forms, speaks the world of the colonizer. Okay, so by speaking the language of the colonizer, the colonized participate in those cultural expressions. So to speak as the colonized is therefore to participate in one's oppression and to reflect the very structure of your alienation in everything from vocabulary to syntax to intonation. And it is true that many Afro-Caribbeans speak Pidgin and Creole as part of the everyday life, but Fanon, in a claim that certainly doesn't age well in modern Caribbean theory, measures Pidgin and Creole expressions against French, arguing that Afro-Caribbean speaking in those registers is a fallen, impoverished version of the metropolitan language and thus participates in inferiority. In this way, vernacular speech speaks the colonizer's world into existence in naming the colonized as derivate, less than, and fundamentally abject. Now, what has changed is that the Caribbean theory, as I mentioned, from the 70s onward to the present, has been dedicated to defending the legitimacy of creolized language and cultural forms and advocating for celebrating and embracing these forms and actually distinguishing themselves from the colonizer by this Creole language that becomes a power tool, actually, for reversing some of this inferiority. And we see this with a lot of marginalized groups, right, where they celebrate and advocate for their culture. And we have here, for example, there is even now um, in some of the schools in Martinique, in Guadeloupe, they have actually a basic Creole conversation for school staff. It's very interesting. For example, bonjour, good morning. And this is something that I've noticed in other cultures as well. For example, I lived in New Zealand for 9 months when I was a lot younger, when I was 18. And I witnessed the presence of the Maori language in a lot of the school documents, in many documents of New Zealand. So they have English, and then as a second language, a lot of the documents, a lot of the materials are also in Maori. So we see um, this emergence and appreciation of the colonized culture. And in this previous slide, for example, we have the Louisiana Creole, and we'll talk about Louisiana Creole in the video. We'll analyze the video that looks at the Cajun culture. And here we have the Louisiana Creole and the Haitian Creole. So we have, those of you who have taken French, you can tell that it's pretty similar, right, to French, but also in some words different, right? So instead of I, they say mo, you, tu, to, he, she, it, li, and then my friend, mos amis, instead of mon ami, your house, to la maison, our dog, nos chiens. So we do have, it's almost like a version of French, right? And it is a version of French that has been, that has the marks of the indigenous populations from that area, okay? Now, continuing with the chapter that we have, that we're reading for today, Fanon argues that Blackness is also a construct identity that exists for the purpose of distinguishing between Black and white. And Fanon explains that because of his Blackness, his identity is based by others on a fixed image. And what Fanon is implying here is the idea that outside of racial discourse, the term Black and white possess no meaning, okay? So people, for example, from a predominantly Black society, they don't refer to themselves as Black, they are just people, right? So it was again, the dominant white society that imposed these notions and these terms on them. So for them, it's just, even in their society, for example, somebody in the Dominican Republic, they can have darker skin tone, lighter skin tone, but they don't have this dichotomy of Black and white like we do. For example, like they have in Europe, okay, or in other countries. Chapter 6 that we're reading this week is titled The Black Man and Psychopathology. And in this chapter, Fanon proposes to test how the psychoanalytic theories of Sigmund Freud and Alfred Adler can be used to explain the Black man's vision of the world, that is the Black experience. So we already have this psychoanalytic theory, and you probably have heard about Freud. And he says that a lot of these theories sometimes cannot be applied to the Black experience, okay? Because in the case of Black people, this is the collective experience of having been colonized and made the subject of racial hierarchy. And this is why Black children are made abnormal by white dominant culture, according to Fanon. And he actually mentions in his book that he says, as long as he remains among his own people, the little Black follows very nearly the same course as the little white. But if he goes to Europe, he will have to reappraise his lot. For the Black man in France, which is his country, will feel different from other people. One can hear the guilt remark, the Black man makes himself inferior. But the truth is that he's made inferior. The young Antillean is a Frenchman called upon constantly to live with white compatriots. Now, the Antillean family has, for all practical purposes, no connection with the national, that is, the French or European structure. The Antillean has therefore to choose between his family and European society. In other words, the individual who climbs up into society, white and civilized, tends to reject his family, Black and savage, so-called, on the plane of imagination, in accord with the childhood elements that we discussed earlier. And he continues saying, furthermore, the white domination of culture prevents Black children from accessing the catharsis, which is the reliever of unconscious tensions. And Fanon describes this with reference to comic books and suggests a form of catharsis might be found in educational materials and comics designated specifically for Black children. And Fanon suggests that the solution to this widespread psychological damage is what he calls collective catharsis. And according to him, all societies need to have avenues through which people can express their anger. And children's comics, such as Mickey Mouse, can be one such avenue. But the problem is that these cartoons were written by white people for white children. And sometimes they contain imagery, racist imagery, as we see here, and thus cannot perform the function of catharsis for Black children, even though they are, he says, beloved in the Antilles, in the islands of the Caribbean. And comics encourage Black children to identify with the white heroes of the story, which sows further feeling of internal conflict. And he argues self-hatred with the Black population. And Fanon suggests that there should be specific comics, songs, and history books designed for Black children to help them avoid feelings of alienation. Now, in regards to Fanon's legacy, of course, some of his ideas are not perfect and may be outdated by today's standards, but tracing the development of his writings helps explain how and why he has become an inspirational figure, firing the moral imagination of people who continue to work for social justice, for the marginalized and the oppressed. And as we mentioned, Fanon's first work, Peu Noir, Masque Blanc, Black Skin, White Mask, was his first effort to really articulate a radical anti-racist humanism that adhered neither to assimilation to a white supremacist mainstream, that was not a solution for him, nor to reactionary philosophies of Black superiority. And while the attention to oppression of colonized people that was to dominate his later works was present in his first book, its call for a new understanding of humanity was undertaken from the subject position of a relatively privileged Martinican citizen of France, because he did study in France and he was able to even practice there as a psychiatrist for a while. And then in search of his own place in the world as a Black man from the French Caribbean living in France. Okay, so that's for the book chapter that I selected for this week. And then the other videos on this week's topic are history of racism, a French taboo. And I like for you as you watch this to keep in mind Fanon's idea and see if you can see them reflected or not in some of the information that we have in the video. Next, we have a very interesting video that talks about the Louisiana Cajuns that are keen to preserve their identity and their Creole language. And we also see what happened to them in the 1920s when they were forbidden to speak their native Creole language and the impact that that has had on the population of French origin in Louisiana. And next, we are ending with a traditional recipe from the Caribbean, from Martinique and Guadeloupe, because we talked about Martinique quite a lot in our lecture today. And some of you have written to me and told me that you really enjoy when we talk about food in our class and this cultural aspect of the French culture that relates to food. So what's interesting that in Martinique, Guadeloupe, and the other islands, people use the ingredients that are native to their islands, and one of them is the cassava root that I have right here. It's looks almost like a potato, but it's a root, and you have to peel it and boil it, and people use it instead of potatoes. And then we also have, so because it's in the tropics, a lot of the fruits and veggies grow really big. We have here an avocado. It's very big, and this is from the Dominican Republic, and it's used in a lot of dishes as well. But for us, I selected a recipe that has ingredients that everybody can find at their most supermarkets or markets, and they can prepare this at home if they like. So the title is How to Make a Colombo, a curry chicken from French Caribbean, by a lovely lady who explains to us how to make this very delicious Caribbean dish. All right, so hope that you enjoyed our lecture for this week. If you have any questions, send me an email. Have a good rest of the week, and I'll talk to you later. Okay, au revoir. Goodbye.